I'm going to talk a little bit about Clyde Gateway and our Green Regeneration and Innovation District and give you a little bit of background that, as us as a company and what we're doing in terms of our journey to net zero and how D2 Grids plays an important role within that. First of all, we are a partnership. We're a partnership between South Lanarkshire Council, you're on the South Lanarkshire Council side of the boundary today, Glasgow City Council, Scottish Enterprise, who are here with us today, and we're supported by the Scottish Government. We are a charity, and we also have a trading subsidiary, and we are about people, place and jobs. And what we do with the charity is that any of the development returns that we make as we progress our regeneration activities, we gift aid those back to the charity, which allows us to distribute those funds across a whole range of activities. And it allows us to deliver on people, place and jobs. It's part of what we are here to do. We can't do that alone, of course, but I've mentioned our European partners as part of our project today, but also supported through the Scottish Government and LCITP in particular. That's been critical for us on this project, and it's been critical for us across a range of other activities. And within the D2 Grids project, we're also delighted to have SSE as supportive of that project through the Sustainability Development Fund. I think for all of us that are involved in these types of activities, you know, the more people that we can bring towards these kind of demonstrator projects, I think the more we can all share in the knowledge from that. In terms of where we are today then, most of you hopefully will know the Clyde Gateway boundary, but just to get your bearings, we're in Cunningar, which I'll pick out as we go through it. It's in there. Oh, sorry. So we're in Cunningar, just over here. Celtic Park's at the top. We have Tory Glen at the bottom, where Mulsmire Park is just opening at the weekend. The River Clyde running through the area, and you'll see the three key railway stations in Rutherglen, Kilmarnock and Bridgeton. So we cover an area of just over 2,000 acres, around 840 hectares. And in terms of our grid designation, then we have what we term an integrated infrastructure approach, and that's not just about hard infrastructure, it's about soft infrastructure as well. And it's about all of these elements contributing towards our net zero journey. I'm going to go through each of these on an individual slide, so I'm not going to read them for you here at this particular point, but as I go through, I'll kind of build up our approach, and ultimately starting with the remediation of brownfield land and finishing with skills development. Before that, the core projects that make up our grid, or our Green Regeneration Innovation District, is the BGS Glasgow Observatory, and you'll hear much more about that today and have an opportunity to visit the site later on. Our community energy project in Kilmarnock, in partnership with Scottish Water Horizons. Donald's in the room today. That project is now live. We'll be servicing one of our new developments, as well as some new housing. And then, of course, our D2 Grids project, 5G DEC, primarily to support Magenta in the initial stages, but hopefully rolling out as we develop the project. Alongside that, important projects in green space and biodiversity, Cunningar Loop, which you're here today, Mulsmire Park, which opens at the weekend, and if you are available on Saturday, I'd encourage you to go along to the opening of that, and then Kilmarnock Riverside Park, which is currently on site at the moment. Sustainable transport as well, our active travel, key routes and spaces. Kudos to you today if you cycled, but if you did, you probably came along the national cycle route, which then connects into a range of other routes through our area. And most of our key routes and spaces are now complete. We're augmenting those as we go, but you can cycle here from the city centre in just under 10 minutes. Bus infrastructure, which we've invested in heavily as well, and then finally skills development, which we see as a key element in terms of the just transition and the overall journey towards net zero. Cunningar Loop, I've mentioned, and then I'm just going to focus in on Shawfield and Kilmarnock as being some of the core areas in which we're working. So this kind of zooms in a little bit on Kilmarnock. You can see the energy centre owned and operated by Scottish Water Horizons, the Kilmarnock and the Magenta sites, and some of the projects that are sitting around that that contribute towards the projects that will be served by the district heating network as well as 5G DEC. So starting just going quickly through those points. So remediation of brownfield land is critical for us. I think we've talked a lot about retrofit first as being an approach, but it doesn't recognise the areas like Clyde Gateway and the other areas require development in order to be able make a step forward. And what needs to underpin that is remediation of brownfield land. This is an example of our site at Magenta. This will be the site that will be served initially by the 5G DEC project. Flood management, I've used the bridge as an example of that. But flood management, again, is critical as we deal with the issues of climate change. Shortly they'll be publishing the new River Clyde model, and that's going to show that some of the work that we've done over the last decade has mitigated a number of the impacts of climate change and flooding with the work that we've done at the Athletes Village, at Damarnock Riverside, and as well as at Shawfield in this area. Surface water management. If you walk through our area, we like to show you surface water management. We like to show you suds ponds. We like to show you these types of swales as part of our key routes and spaces, but that's all contributing towards sustainable development and how we drain these particular areas. Moving on to green space and biodiversity, Cunningar Loop is an example of that. This is a former landfill site which has been remediated, which we've invited the public in to use. We're currently expanding this area, but it plays an important role in developing our green space and biodiversity across the Clyde Gateway area, and a couple of other examples I mentioned like Mogsmire Park, the Damarnock Riverside Park and elsewhere help to mitigate some of the impacts of development that we anticipate that we will have. Reuse and renewal. This is our Eastworks development. This will be the first building connected to the district heating network and serviced by the Energy Centre from Scottish Water Horizons. But it's not just about buildings and about retrofit, it's about the reuse of roads, of infrastructure. Why build new infrastructure when we can augment existing infrastructure? In terms of roads infrastructure as well, why build new roads when we can develop in areas where they already exist, and by upgrading them can provide benefit to the existing communities. Building energy performance, this is one Rutherglen Links. You may have passed that on the way here. Still one of the best performing buildings in terms of its energy performance. We took a fabric first approach here. So as much as we are big advocates of district heating, as well as 5G DEC, we're not saying that it's a one size fits all, and there will be many occasions when fabric first is the appropriate solution. And this is an example of where we've delivered a fabric first approach. Then moving on up that ladder to district heating and cooling. On our kind of district heating and cooling journey, in the initial stages I could not get a consensus on what the right type of technology was. I've talked about temperatures more than I care to mention through that period, but we took the brave pills and we put the pipes in the ground, and I think I felt if we put stainless steel insulated pipes in the ground, it could pretty much take any temperature. So that was our approach, just get it done. But we've been able to develop the project since then. Sustainable transport, we don't impact that directly. There's bigger things that happen around that, but this is the Damarnock Station, a key example of that approach. And then finally moving on to developing skills and jobs. And that's where the industry comes in. If we're going to make this net zero transition, if we're going to make a just transition in the way that we all hope, then it's industry that needs to get behind it with the public sector partners as well. And we've developing skills and jobs with community benefits, but there's much more to be done. And we feel that there's a genuine skills gap within that net zero industry, and we feel that it can be filled as we go forward. So thank you for coming today. As I said, we've got a whole range of speakers today, and I'll be delighted to take you through those as we go. And the first one is from our partners at Vito, a part of the D2 Grids project, and I'm particularly looking forward to this presentation. I'll just maybe invite Amelia to the stage.
How do I change it? Yes, okay. Hi, good morning everybody. I'm Emilia Motowska and I'm coming from Belgium, from Research Institute Vito, that is based in Belgium in Genk. Also, I'm part of Energyville, that is a combination of multiple institutes. They are actually all of them building on energy systems on a certain location in Belgium where former mine CETA was taking place. Let's see. Today, I will present part of the core principles that were developed in the frame of this gorgeous project, D2 Grids project, about 5G district heating and cooling networks. What is a 5G district heating and cooling network? Actually, you have a network that has two lines, the cold line and the hot line, where you couple different users and providers of heating and cooling, where you try to ensure a flexible and resilient energy network using all the resources available in order to meet the heating and cooling demands of various users. Not only for now, but also in the future. So you want to have a network that is good for meeting the heating and cooling demands for now and the future. You want to build a network that is actually future-proof. Within the D2Grid projects, a set of principles, actually 5 principles, have been developed. Despite the fact that many academics do not support the concept of a 5G district heating and cooling networks, in D2Grids the people believe that actually 5G it's a completely different principle, because you try to close the energy loop, also to use low-graded sources for low-graded demand, and also to enhance the decentralized and demand-drivenness energy supplies, and also to try to have an integrated approach of energy flows and use the local sources as priority sources, both for thermal as for electric energy. I will present these principles one per one. First of all, 5G district heating and cooling networks, it means that you try to close the energy loop. What does it mean? It means that actually first of all, you try to reuse the energy and to close the energy loops in a not throwing away any energy, whether it's heating or cooling energy, and whatever you cannot exchange in the energy, you would like to have it stored for a temporary imbalance in a network. Also, you try to exchange first at the level of buildings, and then at the level of the neighborhood, and if not possible, you try to do the exchange at the city or at the district level. So you start from bottom up. So try to exchange everything that is possible, first inside the buildings, and then the buildings amongst them, and then at city or district level. For the first part, at closing the energy loop, we define as KPI for an 5G network. An energy network has to have a large percentage of internal energy exchange. And also, one of the KPIs, so we have 2% of internal energy exchange and percentage of internal energy supplied to the loop. So we have a loop, energy loop, and you try to supply as much as possible energy to that loop. So you have the low temperature heating and cooling loop, and beside exchange of the energy inside your buildings, you can also exchange the energy with the heating or cooling loop. The second principle is that we, in the 5G networks, you will try to use the low-graded sources for low-grade demand. So as everybody knows, if you have high grade energy sources, it's not good to use them for low grade demand. So all the waste heat that is at high temperature level, it's better to use in other industrial processes that, for example, need high grade heat, instead of downgrading the heat and use it just for district heating, for example. So the second principle says that actually you would like to use the energy at the quality that is needed. Don't downgrade your waste heat or any heat that you can have in your available just for heating your houses. Use better low-grade energy sources like this shallow geothermal, the industrial waste flows, but take care of the temperature. Better use low-grade industrial waste. And also try to use the local available sources. Don't use them, bring them from far away. For this part, we also had defined the KPI that says that also in a 5G district heating network, you should we define the let's say the temperature. So all the waste heat or all the energy sources that are below 50 degrees, they are actually for us low graded energy sources, and everything that is above, so here it's above the 50 degrees, we consider them high graded energy sources. It is our perception of 5G networks. So we define as low graded sources everything that is below 50 degrees. Of course, for heating and cooling, for heating it's below 50 degrees. So you need to have a high percentage of low graded sources that are used exactly in those 5G networks. The third principle is the DDD principle, decentralized and demand-driven energy supply. It means that your sources can be spread around, and also they are demand-driven energy supply. The energy will be supplied only when and where it is needed. Don't try to avoid as much as possible storing the energy, but enlarge the energy exchanges. Also, the temperature will be raised only where you need it and when it's needed. So you keep the ambient loop, the cold loop, and the heat loop at a certain temperature, and you enhance the temperature, or you bring the temperature lower depending on your needs, on your heating and cooling needs. And actually, you try to put, let's say, clusters of end users, of small end users, to cluster them depending on their energy needs. For this principle, the third principle related to DDD principle, decentralization and demand-drivenness of energy supply, we would like that the thermal losses in the networks are kept low. So you try to have energy loop, a heat loop, and a cold loop that they have low temperature, and you try to minimize the losses in these loops. So the KPI that we actually calculate is the thermal losses within the ambient loop. They have to be low, and also the decentralization of the district heating and cooling network is quantified by the number of active substations. If you have a lot of substations, it means that almost each of your end users will be operated with a certain substation, and this shows you that actually you have a good decentralization of your network. The fourth principle says that also the thermal network cannot be decoupled by the energy network. So it's better to have an integrated approach of the energy flows. So you have energy of different kinds, electrical, thermal energies, and you have to try to remove the split incentives. For example, some electric network operator, they provide incentives if you use less energy in the peak times, but you have to couple these ones also with the thermal demand. So it's better to keep all the energy flows in the same in an integrated approach in order to maximize the energy delivered and use. What does it say for us? You want to, in a 5G district heating and cooling network, you do not look only at the thermal energy, but you look at combined electric and thermal energy, and you try to have an integrated approach for this. And you use more smart controls that you will try to use sector coupling using these smart controls. For this, for the integrated approach of energy flows, we use two KPIs for quantifying the percentage of which the certain district heating and cooling network, it's matching with the 5G principles. We know that all the district heating and cooling networks are slightly or a lot over-dimensioned. So the virtual minimum capacity needed in the network is actually a lot overestimated when you design a network. But if a 5G network is correctly designed, your virtual minimum capacity needed is slightly lower than it was in a normal 4G or 3G network. Also, we try to compare the virtual minimum capacity needed to the design phase and the installed capacity in operation. As I mentioned, everything has to do with the over-dimensioning. A lot of district heating and cooling networks are over-dimensioned because they take into account the worst case scenario when the coldest day occurs, but coldest day occurs maybe lowest temperatures just a few days or a few hours, and it's maybe not worth to dimension your network for this period, but also try to be as low as possible and use the energy exchanges in your network. The 5 principles of KPI, or the principle developed in the D2Grids project, sets as priority using the local sources. Local sources of any kind, thermal sources and also electric sources. You want to actually to limit the transport losses, electric or heat losses, and also to prevent the energy waste. And also, even if it's not possible, to make the investment that they are benefit of the local area of the network. And also that it becomes more and more important, try to remove the dependency of the foreign or distant sources. That is actually one of the important principles. When we quantifying these principles, we are looking at assessing the origin of the thermal sources and of the electrical sources, the amount and the origin for each of these sources. For the thermal sources, various levels have been implemented. So if we have local sources less than 10 kilometers, we consider them as internal sources. Regional, it's in the region of 50 kilometers, national 50 kilometers, above 50 kilometers, international above 50 kilometers or not within the borders of the country. In Belgium, we have networks that are really close to the borders, so you can go beyond the borders, but they are still considered as external sources, even international sources. For the electrical sources, we have just 2 levels: internal sources produced in the neighbors of in the limits of the source of the network, and also the electricity grid. So both KPIs that are calculated are assessing the amount and the origin of this of the sources, of the thermal and electric energy sources. Just an example, at the location of Vito Energyville, we are in developing phase of a low temperature district heating network. We call that a kind of playground where we can actually, with different stakeholders, we will try to implement and to see what are the advantages, disadvantages of different devices that are connected to a low temperature district heating grid, where you have 2 temperature levels, 2 collectors that we are calling them. Actually comes back to the network name. We will have different buildings connected to this network. Actually, all the buildings are commercial or small industrial buildings, not yet any residential building connected to this network. As you can see, you have two loops, one a cold loop with temperatures between 9 and 12 degrees Celsius, and one, let's call it hot loop. But anyhow, you see the temperature level is 14 to 18 degrees, so still low temperature, and the boosting of the temperature to the hot or to the cold will happen only at the building level. You have the ATAS systems connected also on the high temperature or low temperature ambient loops, and the name of the network is called collector. It comes from the two collector lines, high temperature or low temperatures. And it's important we have here prosumers, so not consumers, but users. They are producing and using thermal or electrical energy. In order to make it more visual, we are using Sankey diagrams in all the pilots that are attached also to D2 grids. These Sankey diagrams actually shows the energy that is needed for heating and cooling demand, that the energy is taking out of the geothermal wells so much energy per year, electricity taking from the grid, and you have the losses and the pumping and electricity that it can be used for heat pumps or for other space heating demand. This is just a visual representation of the energy needs in per year basis, that you can see that with these energies you can meet all the heating and cooling demands of a certain sitter. This is just used for design purposes. It is not used for quantifying the energy demands in a certain season, but just to have an overview picture or how the energy system is behaving. For the case of Henk, where the collector network will take place, there is a small mistake. So I said low temperature is between 9 and 12 degrees, and high temperature between 14 and 18 degrees temperature. We computed all the KPIs that I presented before, and for all of them we have computation in terms of percentages, but finally they are converted to numbers, rankings, and they are from 0 to 10, and for each of these KPIs we computed these KPIs, where for example, for our case of Henk, we do not have any renewable energy coming directly from the grid, so it has a very low score for the electricity location. All the electricity is taken out from the grid. That is not a good KPI, but anyhow, for the self-sufficiency and self-exchange, and also for end users per substations, you see that you have higher scores. So all the percentages were transformed to a set of numbers that gives you in general how this network is performing with respect to KPIs related to district heating and 5G district heating and cooling networks. This is another example of a 5G district heating and cooling concept in the Netherlands. It's the leading partner of the D2 Grids project, and they have also their district heating and cooling network concept that is fitting with a 5G principle. If you are interested to have more information about this, please contact us, or I will not present this because it takes a lot of time. But if you have questions, please just do not hesitate to contact one of us or any colleagues that is working in D2 Grids project. You are welcome to ask any questions or just contribute to the project. And I wish you really have a nice time today. And if you have questions, you can ask them now or later on.
We'll have a Q&A later.
Yes, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will have an opportunity later on for question and answers, and I'm sure there'll be a number for our European partners. I think the point about local energy in under 10 kilometres, I mean, that's a kind of issue here for us in Scotland. In many of our communities, we can deliver that element to it, and that's why 5G DEC is of particular interest to us and to others. So next on stage we have Doreen Reid from Scottish Enterprise, accompanied by Ruth Bush from Ramble. We'll be talking about Scotland's opportunity to be a leader in 5G DHC. Scottish Enterprise is a partner of Clyde Gateway, and we've been working with Scottish Enterprise across a range of projects, but the opportunity to work in partnership, to innovate together and to support projects is one that we've welcomed throughout this process. So looking forward to today's session. Thank you.
Thank you. Broken it already.
So it's just that one there.
Oh, okay, cool, thank you. This is why I don't get out much. So, good morning everyone, and first of all, thanks to Clyde Gateway and D2 Grids for the invitation to speak today. My name is Doreen Reid, and I'm with Scottish Enterprise in the low carbon heat team, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Aaron Kirkbright with Ramble. Ruth is joining us tomorrow, hence a bit of confusion there. Aaron was one of the co-authors of the report, and I've shamelessly brought him with him today so he can answer all the technical questions. Okay, so technical questions go to Aaron. So, and for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you'll see that's actually a photo of the Energy Centre at Queen's Quay, which is a 4G heating system. And we were there a couple of weeks ago with colleagues from our work, so it was great to get out and see that. Not been here before, so I have to say it's absolutely fantastic to be here, especially since I'm going to put Martin and Dave Townsend on the spot now, because in 2016 we did a learning journey to Heerlen in the Netherlands. So it's fantastic to think that from that learning journey we've come to the position that we're in today. So brilliant. Also, I didn't want to steal the thunder from the AMID's presentation, didn't want to steal their photos, so I'm doing you guys a favour. So, Scottish Enterprise commissioned Ramble to undertake a study analysing the potential for Scotland to be a leader in fifth generation heating and cooling networks. That study was completed at the end of last year, and myself and Aaron are going to give a bit of a snapshot of the study. It's over 30 pages, so we've picked out some of the key points from the report, but don't worry, we've got a link to the full report in the slides, which I'm sure will be made available to you, so that will be some good bedtime reading for you later. So what we're going to cover today, a bit of introduction and background for myself, and then going to hand over to Aaron to talk us through the kind of the ideal scenario for a 5G DHC network. What are the advantages and challenges, particularly from a Scottish perspective, a look a little bit at the supply chain, and then what is the potential for Scotland to be a leader in this area. So why did we decide to do this study? Well, both 4GDH and 5GDHC have a significant role in decarbonising our heating systems, and that transformational change has been very much driven by Scottish Government targets, and also developing a kind of a framework of regulation and policy around driving the change that we need to see, as well as providing funding mechanisms such as the Very Welcome Heat Network Delivery Fund, which was launched earlier this year. Now, Scottish Enterprise, our role is to translate that transformational change into economic benefit for Scotland. So as a result, we wanted to commission a study to help us understand the potential for 5G heating and cooling in Scotland, what's the implications for Scotland, understand the current state of play in Europe, and establish basically if there is an opportunity for Scotland to become a leader in what is an emerging area. And if so, what further steps might be required to help deliver that ambition. thought it would be useful to remind ourselves of the size of the prize. Another piece of work that we did with Ramble was a recently completed report looking at key components for heat pumps and heat networks. And as part of that piece of work, we asked them to put a value on the kind of heat network opportunity in Scotland. So they basically took the Scottish Government targets of 2.6 terawatt hours by 2027 and 6 terawatt hours by 2030 and translated that into the value that you see there. So between now and 2030, a cumulative value of 5.2 billion. So it's a sizable prize to play for. We also asked them to look at the wider UK market, and the figure on that was some 27 billion. So this diagram here, as you can see, 5G district heating basically continues the trends of decreasing temperatures and increasing efficiency, but then it breaks the mould in terms of a configuration of what a network actually looks like. And for the definition of our report, a 4G heat network was operating at lower temperatures. It was a centralised system and it was incorporating renewable energy, whereas 5G district heating is a decentralised system, so you're looking at having heat pumps in all the buildings. It's operating at ambient temperature and it's bidirectional, as Amelia was mentioning, and it's supplying both heating and cooling. This is just the structure of the report. The three areas here, as I say, we'll touch on in the presentation, but the full content is in the report. As I said, it's an emerging area, so there wasn't a huge amount of desk research that we could use. So we were very reliant on interviews, both internally with Ramble experts. I believe there were some quite interesting discussions around the report, as well as external organisations, both in Scotland, the wider UK, and obviously our European colleagues who have a lot of experience in this area. Now, I'm going to hand over to Aaron. We're tag teaming here, and I'll come back a bit later.
Thanks, Doreen. So, quick introduction to me. I am an engineer at Ramble. Since starting about a year ago, in terms of fifth generation, I've done some modelling work on the D2 Grid's fifth Clyde Gateway network. I've done some site supervision work on the AMIDS network, and I've worked on this report for Scottish Enterprise. So I've decided to start with the ideal fifth generation network, which you actually saw earlier on. So it would have dwellings, industrial customers, offices and shops, storage, long-term, short-term, renewable waste heat sources, all powered by renewable electricity. But the reality is that this specific network probably doesn't exist in Scotland. There's unlikely to be a location that all of that is in the one place. However, fifth generation networks are very flexible, and you don't need all of these aspects for it to be a viable network. So the point in this diagram is you don't need everything on there for it to be a functioning, viable network. You just need some of it, and that definitely does exist in Scotland. So moving on to some of the advantages and disadvantages, specifically from a Scottish perspective. So the existing skill set we've got pipe installers that have worked on the gas network and the water mains, and they should be able to already install fifth generation pipe work. We've also got boiler installers, and if they take a course that takes under a week for a competent boiler installer, they can learn to install a heat pump that can be used in these networks. In terms of flexibility, fifth generation networks allow you to have different temperatures in each building by just placing a different heat pump in each one. So for example, if you've got a tenement building, a new build with that's much better insulated. You can put them on the same network and use different heat pumps. In terms of existing resources, Scotland has a lot of flooded mines that could be used as storage for these networks, and we also have wastewater treatment works where we can take the heat from that to use in these networks. Some of the more disadvantages though for Scotland is the energy demand suitability. So we obviously don't have a huge cooling demand, but we do have cooling demand in certain areas, so it's about finding those areas and using these networks in those areas. The pipework spatial requirements, so because the flow and return temperature of 5th generation networks, the difference between that is lower than a centralised network, the pipework has to be bigger because the flow rate is larger. But by the time you take into consideration the pipework is uninsulated, the difference isn't as dramatic as you might imagine, although it is still slightly bigger. The electrical infrastructure upgrade, so because you place a heat pump in each building, the electrical infrastructure upgrades might be more spread out than if you just had an energy centre. And finally, the understanding of 5th generation is a bit lower than previous generations at the moment, but we can change that. Some capabilities and gaps we found in Scotland's supply chain. So first we've got, for capabilities, we've got building level thermal storage units. So a lot of you will know Sunamp, who are based in Scotland. They're the only thermal storage manufacturer in the world to be awarded the A-grade RAL certification for their phase change thermal storage units. And that allows you to store heat with 3 times the density of a water tank in each building, and it also avoids the growth of Legionella because they don't physically store water. Uninsulated pipework installers I've already mentioned, and trenching capabilities we've obviously got for all kinds of services already. In terms of some gaps, we don't currently have a small heat pump manufacturer. So although we do have Mitsubishi and Star in Scotland, we don't have someone that manufactures small heat pumps that might typically be used on a 5th generation network. And although we've got uninsulated pipework installers, we don't currently have a manufacturer, and we don't have too many ground source and water source heat pump installers, although it is currently a priority of the Scottish Government to get to train up boiler installers to be able to install heat pumps as well. We need to ensure that they don't only train them to install air source heat pumps, that they train them to install ground source and water source heat pumps that can be used on these networks as well. And finally, the management of large ambient thermal storage. So although we do have a lot of flood domains that can be used for this, we don't have any experience with it as of yet, so that would be great to get some experience with that. So the potential for 5th generation in Scotland. So an assessment by Bayes found that 28% of the total heat demand in Scotland could be supplied by economically viable heat networks. Obviously that's not all going to be 5th generation networks, but a chunk of that certainly could be. Because of the kind of immaturity of the 5th generation market, it's difficult to tell exactly how much that chunk could be, but there are some indicators for the potential for 5th generation. So a mixed building stock, which we definitely do have. As I mentioned, tenement buildings, new builds in the same area, you could connect them all up to the same network. Balance of heating and cooling demands, on a whole, we definitely don't have, but in certain areas, we do have a balance of heating and cooling demand, so it's about finding those areas and putting these networks where they exist. And a coincidence of suitable demand and low temperature heat sources. So a similar idea again, where low temperature heat sources exist, near demand, it's about linking them up through these networks. So staying with heat sources, as you can see from the graph here, we have a lot of high grade and low grade waste heat in Scotland. So 5th generation networks are pretty flexible in that they can have they can use high grade or low grade waste heat. without having to upgrade to low-grade waste heat as well. But high-grade waste heat is generally thought of as used better in centralised networks. But that does depend on the frequency of the waste heat, how often it's available, and the amount. So there is occasions where it's still better used in a 5th generation network. So that means that we've got 400 gigawatt hours per year of low-grade waste heat, and a chunk of the high-grade waste heat that could be getting put to use in 5th generation networks and should be getting put to use. However, having a look at this, the amount of waste heat in comparison to the heat available from natural resources such as mines, rivers and ground source is minute. So while it is very important that we use this waste heat, we need to also use heat from other resources as well. So obviously Queen's Quay was mentioned earlier, which is uses heat from the river already in a centralised network, which is great, but 5th generation offers an extra option to try and utilise as much of this heat as possible. And I think it's actually important that with heat networks that we don't decide what type of heat network it is too early on. First we need to look at the demands, what sources are in the area, the timings of their availability, is there any cooling involved, and then consider the best heat network for that area instead of jumping straight in and deciding what's going in there before we know all the information. So current state of 5th generation leadership across Europe. So because of the nascent nature of the 5th generation market, you can't use kind of standards indicators for market leadership, such as revenue, investment, etc. So when we spoke to interviewees, we asked them to tell us who they thought the market leader was and why. Very commonly they mentioned having complex pilot projects, which then took them to believing that the Netherlands was a leader, which we thought was actually very interesting, because if you look at the slide here, you see that they have 1 to 5 projects, whereas Germany and Switzerland have about 15 each. But it was clear that they valued a complex pilot project a lot more than many small projects. So in terms of Scotland becoming a leader, that's very good news, because for having one very big complex project such as the mine water one in Netherlands, which is the one that most interviewees mentioned, we could become a leader in 5th generation. So some of the opportunities and challenges we found for Scotland to try and become a leader. For the sake of time, I'm not going to run through all of these, but in terms of opportunities, develop advanced pilots I've just mentioned is in terms of people we interviewed, they saw that as the biggest sign of leadership. Having some connection incentives and requirements, so that would obviously encourage enhanced development of these networks and much quicker uptake if there were some connection incentives and requirements to join these networks. In terms of challenges, the business model, so the business model for 5th generation is largely unproven because it is so different from centralised networks. You've obviously got consumers, prosumers, cooling, how do they pay for heat if they're supplying waste heat to the network? There's a lot of questions to be answered. So trying to figure out the best business model for these networks is certainly a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for Scotland in a way. The cooling demand I mentioned already, but it's about finding the areas where there is cooling demand for these networks to work. So we then had some recommendations to try and take advantages of these opportunities and overcome these challenges. So firstly, again, demonstrate advanced pilot projects. But these have to be large, multi-use projects with lots of different demands in the network, cooling involved, and basically a realistic network of what you might want it to look like in the future. And that will create really valuable insight into the economics behind 5th generation, and we can compare the costs to 3rd and 4th as well, which is pretty difficult at the moment. Increase awareness throughout the value chain. So obviously for these networks to exist, people have to be aware of them, and for them to be considered as an option. That also would help to make sure that the skills are there to be able to construct and design these networks in Scotland. Thirdly was map sources and demand. So since this report was published in November, I believe the Scottish Government have actually already started to do this. By mapping the sources and demands, we would be able to determine much more easily where these networks might be suitable, and that will obviously help these networks develop quicker. And finally, develop the business model. So by developing the business model, that would be an opportunity for Scotland to show itself as a leader by doing something that hasn't necessarily been done yet. And it comes hand in hand with these pilot projects by testing out the business models on real projects. So Scotland's opportunity to be leader. So to conclude, we found that there is an opportunity for Scotland to be a leader. The market is very nascent and Scotland does have some capability, but we do need to develop others if we do want to become a leader in this. More information on waste heat sources will support identification of opportunities, and that is already happening, which is fantastic. And finally, the research also highlighted the need for innovation in some areas such as business models, but we do have fantastic universities in Scotland, so hopefully that's something that they could get involved with, and we could figure out the best way to roll out these networks. So I'm going to pass you back to Doreen now, who's going to talk about Scottish Enterprises' support for decarbonising heat.
Thanks, Aaron. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, Scottish Enterprise is an economic development agency, and we have 3 core pillars there: international innovation and investment. And then out of those core pillars are kind of a range of activity takes place, including trade support, targeted inward investment, innovation support, lots of good stuff. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see we have a number of national programmes, and that's just the areas that Scottish Enterprise has deemed as priority to kind of be focusing a lot of our efforts on. And at the top there, of course, we have decarbonising heat. And the role of my team is really to ensure that all parts of SE are engaged to successfully deliver that programme. It's a big organisation, Scottish Enterprise, lots of people doing different things, so we need to make sure that they're all on board with decarbonising heat and they know what they can do to help, and also they feed back information to us so that we can help develop the types of intervention that we need to see the sector grow in Scotland. So in terms of, well, what is Scottish Enterprise doing? I'm delighted to say that Heat Source, our cluster builder, was launched at All Energy, and that's been delivered by the Built Environment Smarter Transformation. I keep wanting to call them Sustainable Transformation. They used to be the Construction Scotland Innovation Centre, and that's been led, delighted to say, by Emma Church, who I'm sure some of you will know. Emma, she also works with the Energy Technology Partnership. So we, all the stuff that we do is kind of based on evidence. We went out and we spoke to industry, different organisations, and they said, the heat sector in Scotland is very fragmented. We need something to help bring everyone together and to encourage the collaboration. So voila, Heat Source. So that's all about connecting and building the ecosystems with all the necessary actors that need to come together to make it happen. Now, I said there was a launch event at All Energy, but not all people were able to be there in person, so we're also doing a webinar on the 14th of June, so a shameless plug for that, please sign up. Moving on, we also have recently opened our Low Carbon Manufacturing Challenge Fund. Of course, that's broader than just low carbon heat, but we do have ambition to develop Scotland as a centre of excellence for low carbon manufacturing. Of course, we signed an MOU with Mitsubishi to that effect during COP26. And finally, innovation. So we're preparing a programme of support for capital investment and heat innovation, including SE-led calls and challenges. And since we're as part of D2 Grids here, I'm delighted to say that under Horizon Europe, we will be participating in the Clean Energy Transformation Fund, or Transition Fund, I should say, and that involves 29 countries, being led by Austria. I think that chap is ready for his summer holidays when they come around. And it's focused on not just on heating and cooling, but since one of my team is very much involved, we will be sure that there will be a heating and cooling call as part of that. So, and there will be more information forthcoming on that as well. We do have an online supply chain directory. We've got over 367 companies signed up under segmented differently, as you can see on the slides there. So please go and have a look, see who's on there, and if you're not on there, scroll down to the bottom of the screen and there's a link and you can request to be added. And again, one of the roles of Heat Source will be to help increase our database and better define our database as well. And I thought I'd put some other reports on here just to show that we don't just do reports with Ramble, only joking. So obviously, aside from the report we've been talking about today, there was a report with BRE looking at innovation needs assessment, and there's a big kind of section there on heat networks. There's also Scotland's geothermal supply chain analysis and coal and global market opportunities. That was a study by Optimat, but David with Town Rock was really instrumental in that as well. These reports are all available online, but also as the Heat Source gets established, we'll also be putting all of our reports onto their website. So it will be that one-stop shop approach where you can go and you can look for all sorts of information and it'll all be there for you to find. So what can you do? Well, you can sign up for SE Low Carbon Heat Newsletter. And please do also sign up for Heat Source. Go onto the website, check them out. You can sign up, make sure that you're not going to miss anything. They're going to be, as I say, delivering a range of activities and events aimed at bringing people together, aimed at encouraging collaboration. I mentioned the Heat Source launch event. If social media is your thing, then you can follow them on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Check out our industry directory. And please come and speak to us. I'm here. Neil, put your hand up. There, Neil Kitchen's here as well. Do come and speak to us. We don't bite, only when I'm hangry, but you know, the rest of the time I'm usually quite approachable. And with that, I'll leave you with my contact details and Aaron's contact details. So any questions, please let us know. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and my apologies to Aaron there earlier on for getting that name wrong. I mean, there was a couple of things that came from that presentation, Aaron, that I kind of picked up on. The manufacturing and the potential for growth that we have there. I mean, obviously that's a barrier to growth at this particular point, but the ability to scale that up, to feed into the jobs and skills agenda was one in particular that kind of struck me as being particularly interesting. The second thing then was connection and incentives, and I think for those of us that are involved in the supply side of these types of networks, again, that was a particular point that I think all of us in terms of trying to scale these networks up quickly and how we de-risk those is particularly important. So that was quite a good point I was interested in as well. And then I think the other thing, I'm sure Donald was looking at the huge potential from the wastewater treatment works is potential for low-grade heat. You know, and the fact that we have these across communities, across Scotland, there's an opportunity there with D2 Grids to really demonstrate what can be achieved. Doreen, I think just seeing the kind of range of activities that our colleagues at Scottish Enterprise are involved in, I think it was excellent and a kind of real opportunity there for people to get engaged. I don't want to kind of use the buzz phrase, but I couldn't help but write down decreasing temperature, increasing efficiency. So we'll probably have that on a board before the end of the day. So thank you for that. We started about 15 minutes late, but we are on time in terms of where we are. And the next person to speak today is one that we're really pleased to have British Geological Survey as part of the Clyde Gateway team, and is part of the work that we're doing here in Curringer Loop. Absolutely fascinating stuff, and just ask Vanessa to come up. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. So as you can see, I am part of the British Geological Survey, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about rocks today, but please bear with me. And it's very exciting for me because I spend quite a lot of my time at the moment here in Curringer Loop, because we have one of the observatories as part of the UK Geoenergy Observatories. We have one of them actually located in Curringer Loop. And hopefully on the tour this afternoon, although we can't actually go into the compounds due to construction reasons, I'm hoping we will be able to look over one of them and I'll be able to give you a little bit more information about them. But my talk today, I'm going to focus more on geothermal. So I know most people in this room probably have a good idea of what geothermal sources are. Obviously we need them from the talks that we've heard this morning. I'm also not going to spend a lot of time explaining to people why we need net zero. This group here are more than aware. But what I am just going to point out is that the decarbonisation of heat is proving to be one of the most difficult parts of meeting this net zero. We do have technologies, we've heard about them this morning, but we're still not that close to meeting the aim that we have from the government. And I'd like to really focus today on why perhaps industry, people in this room, are not really grasping some of the geothermal and hence not moving forward, perhaps as fast as some of the other countries we've heard about. Very quickly, as I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about rocks. So I want to just talk to you about geothermal. So all of you are aware that as we go down through the earth, it gets hotter. The geothermal gradient, as an average across the UK, is 27 degrees Celsius per kilometre. It can exceed over 35, and this is related to the rocks. So down in the areas here, down for example in Cornwall, and some of the Scottish areas up, where we have granites near the surface, we will have a hotter geothermal gradient. The other thing to note is that geothermal is also affected by the surface temperatures. So what you'll generally find is that cities are just generally a little bit hotter at the surface. So the first 5 to 10 metres is generally hotter than the next 10 to 15 metres. So there is a temperature inversion. So sometimes it's actually worth going for the very shallow wells because you are actually going to get some greater heat than if you go to, say, the 20-25 metres. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk to you about geothermal itself. So a lot of people will split it into shallow and deep. There is not actually a definition for shallow or for deep. There is not an actual boundary where that will happen. It's somewhere between 300 and 500 metres, and again, it's very much linked to the geothermal. But what we do have, though, is that we have a variation in the temperatures. So shallow geothermal is basically linked to low enthalpy heat. And as we heard this morning, that is kind of the point that is quite exciting in terms of the heat source that we're looking at, particularly for this conference today. Again, I'm not going to go into heat pumps. There's people in this room who know a lot more about it than I do. But we do, obviously, we have either the closed loops or we have the open loop. This one is the one that is of interest to me because the actual scheme that we have in the Curringer Loop is an open loop system, using, in this case, the mine water aquifer. So you can see in terms of resource types, you can get the heat from the shallow ground directly, you can get it from groundwater, you can get it from the flooded mines, and it's the flooded mines that we're looking at in this particular area. I'm trying to read it from here because I don't have it there. So we have some example schemes. So we already have lots of demonstrators out there. It is a proven technology. And that's another reason why we've got to start questioning, why is it not adopted in many more areas? Just a little bit here about ground source heat compared to air source heat pumps. Ground source heat pumps They generally have a lower running cost. They're generally more efficient, particularly in winter, because you do have the heat in the ground. However, they are probably slightly more expensive. Although this is perhaps not of interest for this particular group, we do have to talk about the deep geothermal, because the deep geothermal are the higher temperatures. We're looking at temperatures here of sometimes 50 up to 100 plus degrees. And in general, there are three main different ways that we will get this geothermal, deep geothermal. The first one is the hot sedimentary aquifers. So these, again, coming back to my rocks, these are permeable rocks, they're porosity, they have holes, water will flow through them. And you can actually extract the water directly from here. It doesn't need to have the heat pumps, and you can use the water. The next one, the enhanced geothermal systems. This is where we have our granites generally. So they have this actual radioactive heat built in, so they are hot rocks. The problem with them, they don't have the same porosity or permeability. We're looking at fractures. And really, to get the benefit out of them, you do actually have to enhance these fractures, which in itself could be problematic. Microseismicity is always going to be an issue. At the moment, the large one down in United Downs is showing that that is not an issue, but obviously there is public perception to bring into that. We then have hydrocarbon wells. So across the whole of the UK, there are some deep hydrocarbon wells. A byproduct of a producing well is hot water. So in some areas, they are directly using the hot water from the producing hydrocarbon wells. The other thing, my background, by the way, was from the oil and gas industry. And whenever you drilled a deep well and it didn't find hydrocarbons, we would call it a dry well. But in reality, it's not a dry well, it's generally a water well. So you have a lot of these wells that are dry, which actually do have water and can therefore be reused, perhaps in terms of the deep geothermal. I just want to say that in terms of the hydrocarbon wells at the moment, it's proven, but the scalability, the economic and the environmental concerns are meaning that we're not quite there yet with the technology. It's got a long way to go. But there's about 560 wells that currently could be used across the UK. So it's certainly something that I think should be looked at in a bit more detail. So geothermal itself, we're coming now back to the shallow geothermal, the low enthalpy, the 10 to 25 degrees. It's proven, as I said, there are many demonstrator schemes which are showing that it works well. There's been several areas, even close to here, Shettleston had a district heat that was running from the geothermal. In general, it has a small land area footprint. We'll see that today as we walk around. And it can be used for applications on a range of scales, from an individual house to the district heating scale. The greenhouse gas emissions are low, which is obviously great, which is what we're looking for. And there is a longevity of resource, but I'm going to come back to that one in a minute. We've also got to remember that not only can we get the heat in winter, we can do storage, so that we can therefore hopefully take the heat from the surface and store it down in the ground. But it's not widely used in the UK. So why is that? So this is quite a busy slide, so bear with me, I'll try and cut it down. But this is the barriers that I feel are out there at the moment for industry, and of course I'd love to hear anyone else's views on this. So if we look at the green section, all the green section is relating to the resource itself. So we said the resource is based a lot on geology. At the moment, there is a lack of understanding and therefore a high risk in terms of what size is this resource. How much heat can we extract before the heat stops? What is the recharge mechanism? What is the flow rate? What if it's not sustainable? If people are going to put in the money and the capital and then find that the resource doesn't match it, it's going to be a large waste of money. So at the moment, industry is a little bit scared. We need to de-risk this. We need to understand more about any interference if we put two schemes close together. Similarly, we have environmental risks. At the moment, they're little understood. You know, we're all feeling that if we pump the water around, it should be okay. But what if we're causing problems to the surface water, to the groundwater? So we need to understand the environmental side of it. Similarly, we now have the construction risks. We're going to be drilling. Now, if we're drilling into the deep geothermal, we're going to have potentially some risks. It's not easy drilling, 1,000 metres onshore. Finding locations that we can actually put these schemes, again, is quite difficult. Mentioned earlier, heat is localised. We don't want to transport it, even if we could transport it, we don't want to take it very far, as per the first talk. So therefore, we need to find areas where we can drill safely and put this, although there's a low footprint at the end, there is work in the construction. This leads into issues with supply chains, lack of manufacturing capacity, and the underlying issue for everybody is cost. Is the risk worth the cost? Operational risks that we have over here, and I think we've touched on this earlier. In order to run it, we need to have the skills, we need to have the technology. We've mentioned earlier that that is happening. There are groups now that are helping the training. But it needs to move faster in order to make these schemes worthwhile. People are not going to sign up to something if there is a risk that they're not going to get their heat long term. And then that leads on to our blue on the outside. Now, the blue is a little bit more for tomorrow, but it underlies everything. And that is policy. Policy, regulations, and finance. At the moment in the UK, there is no regulatory system for licensing, ownership, or management of the resource. It's basically using the oil and gas regulations. These are lengthy, they're not always appropriate, particularly for the shallow geothermal. The other problem is that there's no clear indication about the target or desire to invest long-term in geothermal. The government are stating that they want to get to net zero, but there's not a clear plan involving geothermal. There is a white paper, there are various discussions about it, but at the moment it's not necessarily giving the confidence to the industry to invest long term. Everything at the moment is quite lengthy. I mean, I could talk for hours about the number of permits and the difficulties that we had in trying to get this very quite small scheme going on the Cunningar Loop. So it is lengthy, there are processes to go through. Can we make them shorter? And at the moment there's no clear thermal storage regulations, so we can put the heat back in, but there's no regulations. It needs to be changed. So linking in with all of these, obviously we then come to the economic case, and it does become an argument. Why should industry invest in this when we have quite a lot of risks, both on the policy side and on the actual resource? And then we mustn't forget the public acceptance. We're asking the public to move from something that they have been very familiar with to something that has got risks. And there needs to be some sort of incentive to help people move, and cost, and financial cost. So basically, to move forward, I think there's quite a lot of things that still need to be done. Policy does need to be addressed, and that I know there was a meeting tomorrow, which is at the other group for this one. I'm not going to go into any more detail because that's tomorrow's presentation. There does need to be cost incentive. We mentioned earlier that Germany is one of the leading countries. Well, Germany put in a lot of capital. They helped the industry, they helped the homeowners, and they also helped underwrite some of the banks. So the banks were happy to insure with the risk that was out there. So the government has signed on, and that is something that, in the UK, it just needs to be thought about. How is it going to progress? How is it going to go forward? And then we've got the technical issues. So this is coming back a little bit more to my area of familiarity. Need to understand a lot of these risks that I was talking about before. And this is where I'm now going to plug my own project here, which is the UK Geoenergy Observatories. So the observatory that we have here in Glasgow on the Cunningar Loop, it is a mine water geothermal research centre. Basically, it comprises of 12 boreholes located in 4 different compounds. It is linked in to the mine workings, to 2 different mine workings. There's a set of pipe works, and then they come into a heat centre where we have heat exchangers. The whole premise of this is that people can come and they can run experiments. They can try and determine, how do you work out the resource size? What happens if we pump faster? Will we get more heat? What is the recharge mechanism? So it will answer a lot of the technical issues that we have. And anyone can come and use it. We have already lined up of academics, we have industry users, can come and can try things. And where it differs from some of the other schemes that you've heard about, and particularly where it differs from demonstrators, is that it has no end user. So we have a chiller and that's all we have. So if heat is brought out, we don't have to provide a constant heat source. We're not going to have people saying, my hot water doesn't work today. And the beauty of that means that you can try things, and if it doesn't work, nobody is going to complain. So that is what sets it apart. That is why it's a research centre rather than a demonstrator. And hopefully, as we walk around this afternoon, I'll be able to show you a little bit more, and please come and discuss it with me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa. I guess there was a few things there. Real world, at scale, flexible. We're absolutely delighted that we have that facility here in Conager There's a couple of other points that kind of Vanessa picked up on. Heat is localised, so that kind of speaks to some of the other points we were talking earlier on, back to Amelia's presentation about under 10 kilometres. And then heat storage has been a challenge and an opportunity, and I think one in terms of Scotland and our climate, how we tackle heat storage at a localised level, again, I guess is one that probably speaks back to the Scottish Enterprise presentation and earlier on, which looks at what the opportunities are for Scotland. Today, this is a broader industry workshop, but we wanted to show you a real live example of a project happening on the ground. We were delighted that we've been able to engage with our colleagues at Renfrewshire Council and elsewhere on this particular project, and we visited it recently. So we're going to hear from Kevin, who's the City Deal and Infrastructure Programme Manager for Renfrewshire Council, Sam Hassan from Borough Happold, again one of the other consultancies and part of the kind of part of the consultancy groups that are working on these projects and helping us share learning across us as an industry. And then finally, James Reid from FES, one of the contractors involved in this project, but also on our own project with Scottish Water Horizons here in Clyde Gateway. So I'll leave it to you guys in terms of how you're going to coordinate this amongst the three of you, but just welcome you up.
Okay, thanks Martin, thanks for Clyde Gateway and D2 Grids for inviting us to talk here today. The bad news is we've got a 45-minute slot. The good news is we don't intend taking anywhere near that, and we've got the dreaded pre-break slot as well. So some of you have recognised quite a few of you in the room today, so apologies, you've heard some, but hopefully not all of this. I'll start off by just giving a brief overview of AMIDS for those of you that haven't heard it, just to give a bit of background. And similar to Doreen, I've brought the experts for the difficult questions, should you have any. So for those of you who don't know, AMIDS is a collaborative project of local and national importance. It's a collaborative project between the Council, Scottish Government and Scottish Enterprise. And it all started with a catalyst of City Deal funding from the Glasgow City Region City Deal, and it was through those discussions with Scottish Enterprise, and Doreen spoke about that earlier on, and it was through those introductions that the seeds of a district heating network were sown at those early stage. As a bit of background, AMIDS aims to be Scotland's home of advanced manufacturing. The images that you'll see in the next few slides. It was a former unused farm next to Glasgow Airport, as you can see in the mock image there. And through working with Scottish Enterprise, Scottish Government and stakeholders, the vision for AMIDS was developed, and we were really lucky early on to secure anchor tenants in the form of 2 national innovation centres. Acronym central, as you would imagine with these types of projects. So NMIS, the one with a nice heather roof, is the National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland, and that was run by Strathclyde University to look at the challenges of advanced manufacturing Scottish-wide. The NMIS group, that will be their headquarters within AMIDS. And just across the road, we've got the Medicines Manufacturing Innovation Centre, ran by the Centre for Process Improvement, and they're similarly research centre. They're looking at the grand challenges across the pharmaceutical centre, working with partners such as GSK and other pharmaceutical companies. However, from early days, we were looking at AIMIDS as a net zero from the ground up. So that's the enabling infrastructure, which is funded through the city deal, as I mentioned, looking at the embedded carbon and how we can design that with a net zero future in mind. But we also wanted the AIMIDS to be a world-class, not just any out-of-town business park. So we looked at other innovation districts across the UK and indeed across Europe. Things such as the Technopolis report, which was a report commissioned by the Scottish Government. And one of those items was a district heating network. So that's kind of where the idea came from. But still on AIMIDS, it's a 52-hectare site immediately adjacent to Glasgow Airport, offers flexible development space, 150,000 square feet. We've got our 2 anchor tenants I've already mentioned with an unknown development. We've got a master plan, but as with all master plans, the only thing we can guarantee is it won't look like the master plan. But that was one of the benefits that I'll touch on a slide or two about the district heating network. We don't know what AIMIDS is going to look like, so the flexible, modular nature of the decentralised ambient loop was one of the key criteria for selecting that as the preferred solution. Just to give a bit of context, number one is the core AIMIDS site, so that's the farm that is now AIMIDS. But the geographic boundary of AIMIDS is slightly blurred, and there's no limitation of that. And we're working with partners in Westway, which is Scotland's largest enclosed business park just across the river, and in Chinnan Business Park, which is already home to the Advanced Farm Research Centre, which is part of the NMIS group, Rolls-Royce, Terumo Arctic, Peak Scientific, and in Westway we've got the Lightweight Manufacturing Centre, again part of the NMIS group. And we've also got Scottish Renewables in there, Babcock's amongst others. So lots of engineering, lots of manufacturing, lots of expertise and skills already in the area. So AIMIDS is looking to just bring that all under the one umbrella. Just skipping, there's some artist impressions of our master plan that I've mentioned, and the NMIS and NMIC, which are due for completion in the next few months. One of the things that, as well as the sort of district heating and low carbon, we were looking at is making AIMIDS as sustainable as possible, so it's pedestrian focused. You're looking at sustainable travel, active travel taking priority, and we're looking at making the most of our green space and our public realm to make AIMIDS similar to where we are today, not just a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 location. It's somewhere where you can go for runs, cycles, take the family to watch the planes take off, and make that a kind of key place to work, live, and also learn. Now on to what we're really interested in today is the AIMIDS district heating network. Just to kind of take you a whistle-stop tour of our journey, and it's been a long journey to get to where we are today. Some 4 years before we could put a spade in the ground. So back in 2018, as I said, we were looking at what makes successful innovation districts, and one of the things we looked at was a district heating solution. At that stage, we had no idea what it would look like. To be perfectly honest, I had no idea what a district heating network was at that point, which is why I'm not an expert, and I've got these guys. So what that we were looking at, is it viable? What sort of solutions should we be looking at? And through introductions from Scottish Enterprise, we did an initial energy assessment. We were then introduced to the Scottish Government's Low Carbon Infrastructure Transition Programme, LCIDP, and similar to Martin earlier on, that's been crucial in getting this project off the ground. So through the sort of LCIP process, we progressed the concept which Borough Happold were key in identifying and developing to sort of stage 2, 3, and then we went out to procurement in 2021 and awarded that to FES, which James will talk about in a few slides. So it's just really to kind of paint the picture of, these things take time, as Aaron and Dorian and others have said earlier. It's in its infancy, 5th generation heat networks in Scotland certainly, and it's certainly not something that the council's got experience in, so we've leaned on partners, we've leaned on LTITP, but one thing to take away from this slide is that it does take time. as well as the LSIP, Martin touched on it earlier as well, is that the revenue gap is significant, and it's taken the council a long time going through the business case process to get to a place where they are comfortable, but that revenue gap still exists. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow in terms of policy. However, even with LCITP capital funding and RHI for the sort of tariff guarantee, there still is a gap and a leap of faith required to get these projects off the ground. So why fifth generation? Sam,
Thankfully, I won't tell you what fifth generation is, because I think we've heard a lot of that, but there are some nuances, I think, as we've kind of discovered today, and our scheme has got, I suppose, a few things which we'll touch on from a technical perspective. But as Kevin said, Bure Happo joined this project in 2019. At that point, that was through Zero Waste Scotland, who provide assistance doing pre-feasibility, feasibility, and even business case support. So from ourselves, we're part of that framework and come in and provide technical and kind of economic modelling, which can assist in terms of taking a project forward if it is viable. Out of that study, what we developed, I know this is a long journey, it felt like a very short journey. In 2019, we had a hard deadline with LCITP and always RHI funding applications in mind. So quite quickly we had to do an options appraisal, looking at the work that had been done in terms of the loads. A lot of this was speculative and kind of hopeful in terms of the rollout of the master plan, and also the available heat sources. And from that we identified using a 5G, an ambient loop system, taking heat from the wastewater treatment plant, which is about 1.5 kilometres south of the image site, was the most viable. And a big part of that was about the lower cost of the pipe work, using uninsulated plastic pipe work to take heat from the waste treatment works up to the site was significantly lower cost than using traditional steel insulated pipe work. However, as Kevin said, there was also a number of other qualitative benefits for that. A big one being the ability to scale up the project rather than putting a huge amount of investment in at the early stages, bringing all the infrastructure in from day one. In terms of electrical loads, putting in space for heat pumps back at the wastewater treatment plant, and then hoping that we build out, investing in a sort of scalable fashion meant that we could extend that network, extend the network, but also extend the plant at the energy centre. And a big part of it is the heat pumps that go into the buildings. We weren't investing in that kind of large capital investment from day one. That kind of comes as the buildings roll out. Flexibility as well. We did the business case, and I suppose it's one point I've heard before is about that finding that optimum, that ideal for a 5G network. We very much based our business model and our business case on only using the heat. We've got the flexibility, and we hope that we can use cooling as well, and that will improve the efficiency and the business model. But that was not guaranteed, and certainly for the first two off-takers, because of the timing of where their design was when we were involved, we could only really sell them heat. So I think that's kind of point to note, is that sometimes you don't have the ability to distribute heat from the buildings back into the network, and it doesn't mean it's a showstopper. We can still make this work under certain circumstances. So if I'm very sort of simplified schematic, as I say, we're extracting heat from the wastewater treatment works. We decided to do that at the very last part of that treatment plant. So we are using the relatively clean water that is then discharged into the river. The reasons for that, while we sort of get a slight temperature drop, there's warmer places to take the heat from a waste treatment plant. The water quality is better, so there's reduced risk in terms of maintenance. And also the kind of infrastructure and the layout of that site meant we could put the energy centre there, and also we could tie into the point of the Scottish Water's energy infrastructure fairly easily without kind of making a big mess of all the underground infrastructure, which was fairly unrecorded and kind of full of risk, I suppose. So right next to the outfall chamber where we're taking the heat, we've got a little energy centre now. I suppose energy centre in the sense that we take very low grade heat and then we just distribute it from there, from plastic pipework up to the image site. Crossing a bridge as well, which is another time constraint for this project. We had to get our pipes sized so we could get them in the bridge at an early stage so that infrastructure could progress. Once we get up to the image site, we've only got two buildings at the time being. MMIC, they were progressing with gas boilers and a CHP design because of where they were in terms of regulations. They could still do that, meet Section 6 energy requirements, carbon requirements. So we had to talk them out of that. I mean, that's a difficult sell going in with a higher heat sale price, but thankfully they were really receptive to the idea of decarbonising their scheme, and it took a lot of work and kind of collaboration with them to try and move them on to a zero emissions scheme. Enmis were slightly further ahead in their journey of decarbonisation. They were already thinking about air source heat pumps, so the kind of counterfactual for them, the business as usual, was less of a jump. But there was a lot of work that had to go in place, and I think that's another point in terms of collaboration. There's a lot of work done by Kevin up front, speaking to these heat off-takers to get them on board. Thankfully, the ones in the future will have 2 buildings to see and hopefully have good things to say about the way that the network's operating, but it was a leap of faith for them as well, very much in this project, especially as they were at sort of stage 3, stage 4 design. There was a lot of rework that had to happen with us integrating them into the scheme. This is a kind of busy drawing, but I suppose the kind of points of this here is that 5G networks can be more complicated in terms of ownership and demarcation from traditional 4G. On a 4G, you have your energy centre where you're generating your heat, you distribute that to pipework, and you generally have a plate heat exchanger. So you've got this separation between the heat you generate and the heat that's used in the buildings. The model that we've approached, we've adopted in AMIDS blurs those lines. We don't have a hydraulic separation between our heating system and their heating system. We found that to be the best model and approach for this particular site. In terms of from a business perspective, we can control the heat that we supply to them. We have better control in terms of the temperatures and make sure that network and the heating system is optimised. So we've got, from the left-hand side, we've obviously got plant and connection and ownership between us and what Scottish Water sites. We've got our energy centre sitting on their site. We've got the pipework that then goes through highways and kind of green and brownfield sites. And then once we come into the building, we've got our heat pumps. And then we tie in to their building. So it's quite difficult, blurred, and again, that word collaboration, it really kind of needs clear understanding, I suppose, a lot of support from a commercial perspective, how you set up these different boundaries and manage the responsibilities and the risk between them. The other issue there is about interfaces. We need to know how that building needs heat. Again, it's about demand-led. We need to understand when they need heat and manage our systems to deal with that. So that's connections to their building management systems. But also the electricity, again, it's been touched on in terms of infrastructure. We're putting a lot of the electrical infrastructure in at each building rather than a centralised energy centre. So we need to take electricity from those buildings. So it's how do you manage that, have the supplies and deal with that from a commercial perspective. Back to you.
Jump back in there, so tag teaming here. So yeah, just building on the picture that the journey that we described earlier, and concentrating on when we kind of had started having certainty, and that was in 2021, March of last year. So in December 2020 is when the council approved our business case and agreed to the funding and the go-ahead of the project, subject to match funding from LCIDP, which we were pleased to receive in March. As well as the RHI tariff guarantee that I mentioned earlier. We went out to tender following that approval in December 2020, and we actually had to re-tender because the initial tenders we got back were unaffordable and didn't, the business case didn't stack up on those. Reasons for that were predominantly pipe costs, the size that we specified, and also we didn't have, as we touched on the third bullet point, we didn't have land agreements. We were only going through 2 private land ownerships. The rest was in public or Scottish Water land, which we had agreements with. So despite only 2 relatively small parcels of land that we had to negotiate with in the absence of compulsory purchase orders at that time, obviously the heat bill, etc., will help address some of that, and we'll talk maybe more about that tomorrow. So there was pipe sizing and the pipe route. So we value engineered and went back out to tender. And we were able to award that contract to FES in August 2021. And in the meantime, we were busy agreeing heat supply agreements with the 2 off-takers that we've already mentioned, and also with Donald and his team at Scottish Water Horizons and Scottish Water to get lease and access to sewer agreements for the heat source and land for the energy centre. And really since October, the team have been working really hard and quite fast paced. I think without some of the challenges that James will talk about in a few slides, I think without delays to key equipment, we would probably have been finished by now. All the pipes in the ground as we speak, and the plant rooms are 95% complete, with the exception of some key equipment, heat pumps in one of the plant rooms, and some key equipment in the energy centre has been delayed as a perfect storm of Brexit, pandemic, and Ukraine, unfortunately. So that's delayed us somewhat. So we should be complete in terms of construction next month, and following the sort of 6 to 8 week commissioning and testing process, the network will be operational in August. So that's kind of where we are just now. Lessons learned. As I've already probably covered in enough detail, is not to underestimate the programme. It's taken us a long time to get to where we are, and that's a combination of typical public sector governance and processes, compounded by the governance and red tapes of other public bodies and targeting funding calls. As Sam alluded to earlier, there was many a time where we were racing to get business cases and applications in time to fit funding calls, and also the competing programmes of our two off-takers, as Sam's already mentioned. There was lots of times and lots of discussions with those to kind of keep them at the table, as it were. And one of the concessions that you might have spotted in one of the earlier diagrams was with MMIC having gas counterfactual, is that their backup boiler is unfortunately gas, whereas the model going forward would be that would be low carbon as an NMIS. It's the electric boiler, and the main reason for that was just to keep their parallel design, so that we could only give them certainty. As you've seen a slide or two ago of the DHN going ahead was in August last year. They were already beyond their design stages, so we had to run as a parallel process that until the very last minute they could swap out the heat pumps that are now in with their gas-fired CHP should the DHN not go ahead. So there was that sort of to and fro with those. The capital costs I touched on earlier, in terms of the tenders becoming back unaffordable, and the revenue gap as well, and that's around that gap between the initial off-takers. The business case does not stack up, unsurprisingly, with two off-takers, but we were able to demonstrate and get the council to a position that they were comfortable that when as and when AIMS builds out, that gap will be met. However, I do think there's an opportunity there for policy to help incentivise councils, other organisations to take that leap of faith with some support perhaps on that revenue gap. Again, in buy-in from off-takers and stakeholders was the sort of the innovative. It was new. It was getting NMIS and MMIC comfortable with the technology that we were putting in front of them, but also having the faith to stay with us whilst they had also competing demands and construction programmes and funding deadlines, etc. to make. That was key for that. Land assembly I've already touched on in terms of how difficult that made our process without any sort of statutory powers to help smooth that process. And I think without a lead organisation such as public sector or the council, in this case Clyde Gateway, and the projects that we'll see today, we need more of them. We need them to lead the way and demonstrate that this technology, it's not new technology, it's the mix, I think, that we're putting together that's innovative. So I think we've got a job, as Aaron and Dorian touched on as well, to demonstrate that and hopefully make Scotland a leader in demonstrating that and show that this can be rolled out across Scotland and the UK. The determination and flexible approach, I think, has probably came across in the previous points. But also, it's the collaboration that Sam touched on as well, and that was through, all throughout the journey, but also as we've got to construction. I think the approach that we've taken has worked very well in terms of we've retained Borough, who did the concept and developed that to stage 2-3 design, whilst we've also got FES construction. So we've got Aaron and his team at Rambo and Turner Townsend as site supervision and project management in terms of the contract, but we've retained Borough Happold, and I think that mix has been really good in terms of, you know, collaborative and just getting together and having open, honest conversations when it comes to, you know, design. And Sam's able to kind of give the background in terms of what the design intent was, and, you know, so it gets us through some of the issues we've had and tweaking the design as we went through construction. And lastly, peer support. That's through, you know, likes of LCIDP and introducing and bringing, you know, the organisations and Martin and his team and D2 Grids, just kind of giving each other that bit of comfort that we're not alone, as it sometimes feels when you're delivering these large projects. So we've been, you know, to Kilmarnock to look at the stuff that's gone here. We've been to Stirling, we've been to Queen's Quay, and we've been able to speak to others. So I think that's been invaluable in getting us to where we've got to today. Did I skip one now?
Back to me for one more slide. So I think as Kevin touched on there, none of this technology is new. It's used in various different applications, be it kind of gas, water, utility pipework, which we're just repurposing for something different. Heat pumps, abstraction pumps if we're taking water from sewers. All these things we can go and buy. There's people that sell these products to us. Hopefully there'll be more that manufacture them in Scotland or UK in the near future. It's how you put them together which is slightly innovative, but as we do more of these projects, that'll become far less complicated as it appears to sort of the outsiders, but this can be done. There's nothing new here. It's just thinking about it in a slightly different way. Economics are challenging, particularly I suppose when we did this project, things changed really quickly. In 2019, we were looking at a counterfactual of gas boilers and relatively low cost of heat. That's no longer a thing that's going to happen in future studies. Generally speaking, the requirement to go zero emissions on your heating is becoming law in the near future, but generally speaking as well, the BEIS are requiring that projects like this would consider air source heat pumps as a counterfactual. Now, for a project like this, which is one, more efficient, but two, also significantly lower space requirements, there's advantages there, both in terms of cost, but other benefits to potential heat off-takers. From a tendering perspective, as was touched on before, there was a gap, I suppose, in terms of what was in the cost plan for the size of the pipes. When we went out to some manufacturers, we got some price and a kind of cost plan was built, but it was based on stage 2, and that's where getting some experience in the likes of FES and engagement with potential manufacturers and contractors and a wider range of knowledge and experience can really help try and get the cost plan nailed down as quickly as possible, early as possible. Regulatory approval, I suppose, in this instance was primarily with Scottish Water, and I guess the journey for them has been an interesting one as well, and I suppose these things are going to get easier as more of these projects get developed. And then the last point, I suppose, about the business case. There's many more benefits to this than just low carbon heat or reducing, hopefully, fuel poverty in certain circumstances. And it's thinking about that holistic picture, which certainly from a public body is incredibly beneficial to understand the whole thing and not just think about it from a purely an economic or carbon perspective. So, James has been waiting his turn very patiently, so over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Hi everyone. For those that don't know me in the room, I'm James Reid. I'm the Operations Director for FES Energy and Renewables team. So I'm going to discuss with you just some of the challenges, the good and the bad. Probably, I think more importantly, the bad aspects in terms of the project and what we faced on site. I think that's probably what you'll get more from as an audience in terms of the challenges that we faced at site level. So yeah, just kicking that off then, we had, Kevin touched on it, supply chain. We have had issues with supply chain, and I think it has been that perfect storm of, the tail end effects of Brexit, COVID, and now the Ukraine crisis. The challenges that we've had, it's actually been quite strange. It seems to be down at the small component level, down at electronics level. So Kevin touched on one of the pumps. So in the MMIC building, which is one of the plant rooms here, we've got a small variable speed pump. Usually takes 8 weeks to deliver. We ordered it back in October and it came last month. So over 6 months just to get a small pump. And we weren't alone, so it is an issue that we're seeing across the marketplace. I'm seeing it on other projects. I think the key to probably take away from this is probably recognising that it's not a fifth generation issue. So I wouldn't say that will happen on every fifth generation project. I think for the clients and the developers and the contractors in the room, I suppose it's how that programme and that programme risk is managed. So and what allowance is taken into account for any programme delays. So we've had quite an honest relationship on the project, and we've been honest in terms of how we've managed it. I think that's key as well. Sharing procurement schedules, being able to show the clients, the NEC supervisors, the project managers that this is just what we're facing right now. So coordination, as you can see, these are two of the main pipes coming down what we call Wright Street. So each one of those pipes is 600 mil in diameter. So that trench is just over 2.5 metres in diameter. What we've actually got along here as well, we've got HV cables as well as main sewer mains, as well as a water main. So key challenge there is obviously the space required to install these ambient systems. If we think about the traditional district heat network, because of the high temperatures, the pipework is naturally smaller to distribute the same amount of energy. So this is a challenge, whether or not I think, trying to do that in city centre Glasgow, it might be a real, consideration and how that's achieved, considering what's there. We were quite lucky on this project. So 2/3 of the site was currently being worked on by other contractors, so we were able to go in here last August when we were awarded the contract, and a lot of this was already dug up, so we could actually see what was in front of us. Some people won't have that opportunity. So, site investigations, front-end surveys prior to going to market to try and identify routes will, in my opinion, help improve that risk. Also on the coordination aspect, we look at the MIC planning here. The space that's required to install the fifth generation equipment, it took me by surprise. We've done energy centres before where the heat generating plant is local and it is within that central position, whereas we've got the 770 kilowatts each, those boilers, those heat pumps. So we actually ended up having to share BIM models with the incumbent principal contractor, and what we did find, although 90% of it went well, was certain instances where cable trays went on the BIM model that were given to us, and there was clashes of pipework and what have you. So I think probably early on the key there is probably to try and understanding on that BIM model piece is just agreeing that level of what's included in terms of that level of detail. Is busbar, pipework, sometimes people only take it down to a particular size. However, I think it is important to try and get as much upfront as possible. So that was a key one for us, and despite all the front end planning and all the meetings, there was naturally some clashes that we had to come together on. And to be fair, came to a table and helped out as well. So I can't criticise in that same token as well. So on coordination as well, one thing that we didn't take into account as much as what we probably should have done, and it's not a challenge on the concept by any stretch, is the space required for the energy centre. We actually ended up increasing the size of the energy centre following our BIM model exercise. So what we actually found was, because the diameter of the pipework and the diameter of the headers, to actually create the right hydraulic conditions and right hydraulic design and connections to the plant, that we had to increase the size of the plant just to give us extra space to connect into the equipment. So again, that was something that we had to, as a business and as a contractor, to take as a lessons learned going forward, is how we then manage that through that tender piece. Again, I suppose the challenge from a market perspective is just what stage tenders are taken to, whether it's REBA stage 2, 3, 4, what have you. So, we did do some due diligence early on, and we felt it was big enough, but it wasn't until our prefabrication team got involved and we started properly modelling equipment that we actually realised that the size of the equipment and the size of the connections and the size of the valves, that it was challenging, and to make sure that we were leaving a project and a system behind that someone can adopt, maintain properly, do everything else, And also, what's important about this one is also to take into account the future capability. So under this phase, we're installing 3 megawatts worth of abstraction systems. The system can take up to 10 megawatts, so all the pipework size to accommodate that 10 megawatts. So I suppose that's important. It's just, you know, if I'm doing this all over again, I would not underestimate the amount of space required, so just keep that in mind. Obviously, you know, Kevin touched on the duration to get the programme and getting the project to life. Obviously, one of the key ones, some of the key issues that we're facing as an industry is the RHI and the fact that's ended, but certainly the issue we had at this point in time was making sure we meet any RHI deadline. So we were quite lucky in this instance that the deadline has been extended. And I suppose the challenge there was, you know, there was different construction programs, as Kevin touched on. You've got the MMIC, which is one principal contractor. You've got the NMIS, which is another one. You've got the actual Gaia project, which is another principal contractor. So you've almost got 3 or 4 different construction programs that are all leading towards a common deadline that's required to meet to satisfy revenue or funding conditions. So, you know, I think just making sure that things align is important, and to be fair, that comes down to collaboration and discussions, and I think that's gone pretty well to date in terms of, you know, managing expectations and keeping people abreast of what's happening. So stakeholder engagement, again, touching on the number of people involved. You know, on this site, we're working on a Scottish Water site. One thing is we can't detract away from the fact that Scottish Water are there to treat wastewater. That's their principal day-to-day operation. So anything we do, we need to make sure we're not impacting that. And one of the key things that, you know, decisions that were made between Renfrewshire Council and Scottish Water Horizons was to introduce a project manager to help that stakeholder management. And I think that was a real blessing in disguise, because it enabled us to have that conduit to speak to the relevant parties within Scottish Water to get the technical approvals, to get the agreements and where to place the equipment, the site, you know, and even down to coordinate at site level, you know, where compounds should be. And that was really, I think, had that not happened, I think it would have been a lot more challenging to try and get through some of those technical barriers. So another one came up was planning. Again, it's probably just more of a good piece was you know, Renfrewshire Council having the foresight to introduce ducts across the smart bridge. I know Clyde Gateway have done the same here for the D2 grid project, and I think the reality is I don't think we can underestimate the importance of that, because it defined that route. It gave them that opportunity, and I'd hate to think what would happen if that wasn't in place. So again, I think if we can implore anyone who's just thinking ahead and getting that, and for the cost of it at that during the construction of it, I think it's paid itself off, definitely. So also one other thing, just touching on, you know, in terms of bureaus and Rambo's involvement. You know, Rambo's were involved in as a NEC supervisor, and I've put my contractor hats on sometimes, and I have seen it before in the past where NEC supervisors can be seen as disruptors, or you know, contractors can be quite defensive about their roles in projects. I think we tried to take a different track on this one in terms of embracing that challenge and helping them support and fulfil their role, which for me I think has been great. You know, to creating that honest, open, transparent relationship from my perspective is important, so that when we're leaving that project, we're leaving a quality product behind that everyone's happy with what's been left behind. So just making sure, as Kevin touched on, in terms of designs are done properly, you know, systems are integrated and you know, as they should be. So you know, I think that again, something to take away from that would be just that early engagement, getting them involved quite early on, really important, and I would definitely say it's worth its weight in gold. So just some generic comments, you know, just in the back of you know, our experience and where I think I see the opportunities. You know, touch on the supply chain. You know, the pipe that we've installed is HT pipework. So as a nation, we've got, you know, quite a lot of you know, we've got a fantastic supply chain there through Scottish Water, through other utility through the utility market that are capable of installing this type of pipe. You know, it's the same pipe that is, as Kevin touched on, used by gas and mains water systems. So we're not relying on coded welders or traditional 4th generation pre-insulated steel installers. So selfishly, from my perspective, it gives us a greater opportunity to do things either as a business internally or rely on more Scottish contractors more local to the contract rather than having to bring people from afar to deliver that. So I touched on the space. RHI, I think, again, similarly with these kind of projects, I think that's quite key, is understanding what that looks like for Scotland going forward in terms of any future generation subsidy scheme. Obviously, just talking with some of the clients and developers in the room, they talk about the cost of gas and the cost of energy and the cost of electricity. That electricity cost is really important in terms of making these projects viable. I can only imagine what these current rises are doing to the current economic models. But without that subsidy, I think it's a really challenging piece to actually start delivering more of these without for people. So I think that's something that something the government and policy needs to try and take into account. Oh, what happened here? It's me pressing buttons. Sorry. Mentioned about the plan, planning of the infrastructure of the future in mind, stakeholder engagement, and again another one just touching on at the bottom there, just engaging market as soon as possible. Again, I think just we're seeing incredibly challenging market conditions right now in terms of inflation. Every couple of weeks I'm getting letters from suppliers saying there's 10% added on here, there, everywhere in terms of steel, what have you. Coppers are at an all-time high. So having that relationship between client and public and contractors, I think is important to try and make these projects and improve that speed of uptake and hopefully improve the ability for some of these to get to market so as quick as possible. And that was us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a few things there, I think, in terms of the AMIDS project. It speaks to two of the principles which we have at Clyde Gateway, and the first of those is infrastructure must come first, and then secondly, sustainability is built in, and that's a kind of common element that's shared across both projects. I had a few kind of takeaways from that session. There was that point about finding the optimum, and you're probably never going to get there in terms of what you have to do is understand the key interfaces between projects and ultimately get it to work. And I think certainly that's been our experience across our projects at Clyde Gateway and in particular D2 grids. And then sort of 3 points that are kind of, again, I think resonated with us. Firstly, that kind of holistic perspective, understanding that, being flexible and adaptable and having the kind of determination to that. So that was great. Thanks very much for that. Okay, so I've asked a few of the speakers from today, a couple of speakers. So Sam, who involved in the project, we heard about at the end of the session, Doreen from Scottish Enterprise, and then I'm delighted that Hugh Moore is able to join us. Hugh is our energy project manager at Clyde Gateway. He has been the leading light on a number of the projects that we're involved in and has been instrumental in getting us to the stages that we are. So as much as I get to kind of front some of these things, there's guys that's doing the real work and the heavy lifting behind us, and that's Hugh. Now, it was great to see a number of the post-it notes up on the poster, and there was a few things that was coming from that I picked up on certainly 5 minutes ago when I read it, and I know there was a few more going on, but there was some points about getting heat network ready, so, and that probably ties into a broader retrofit challenge. But how do we get our communities, businesses, and industries heat network ready? Grid capacity and constraints, and how that's dealt with, and we're looking at a lot of projects which are heat pump orientated and quite intensive in terms of the requirements for the grid. We have also looking at solar PV and battery storage as part of that, but that was an interesting point. Zoning at a local authority level was another point. The connection fee versus metering and billing, and how we get all of that to work in terms of how it works for the consumer or the prosumer, and then independent advice as well. And one of the energy projects that we're involved in, that will be registered with the Heat Trust. So we'll maybe have some questions from the audience on that. What I'm going to do is maybe just to kind of get us kicked off, and maybe Sam, just come to you first of all. was kind of struck in the presentation about that idea about finding the optimal and how we get to that. But one of the points around a kind of mix of heat sources and how we deal with that in these networks that we're looking at. In our project, we've got a mixture of heat from the wastewater treatment works. We also have the benefit of an energy centre with backup. What's your view on using a mix of heat sources?
I think it's a good idea from a resilience perspective, definitely. That academic optimum that sometimes we strive for from engineers has to always be taken with a sense of pragmatism and realism in terms of how these things operate. And I think the difficulty, I suppose, for a lot of these projects is the unknown about what the real life optimum is and how these things combine together to create something which is very dynamic. From a perspective of wastewater, those temperatures vary constantly. You generally see them warmer in the summer and cooler in the winter, but on a daily basis, depending what's happening in the system, how much rainfall there is, the efficiency of that can vary quite significantly. So having an alternative to that may one, give you resilience, but also potentially provide you a more efficient heat source on any given day, I think is a good idea. How you control that is very complicated, and I think the only way to future-proof that is to have lots of metering, lots of information coming from the BNS, and someone that's on the journey that knows the design intent, but also is there to optimise it. So traditionally with buildings, we're terrible at getting to the end because we're like, finally it's done, walking away and leaving clients to sort of deal with it and trying to work out how to make best use of it. For these types of projects, that just won't work. It needs continued support and probably 3 years as a minimum, but probably even longer to really understand how it works and how to get the best out of it from a district network operator's perspective, but also from the building user's perspective, because we're doing things here which are not the norm on both sides of that fence, I suppose, and it does take a bit of understanding, but to future-proof it, you need the data and you need someone that understands it.
It's an interesting point about at that kind of client level and building owner level, which for us at Clyde Gateway, we're both. I mean, Hugh, from a kind of client's perspective, what's your kind of take on heat networks and the benefits for businesses and occupiers?
Well, I mean, certainly I think the direction of travel in terms of the carbon emission reductions and increasing renewable energy sources is a key requirement going forward. We're not just talking about the immediate needs of businesses, but we're looking towards the future in 20 years' time as we're trying to meet carbon reduction targets. And that's got to be critical to how we invest in new projects going forward and how we encourage the private sector in particular to engage in that scenario. And that's clearly one of the frustrations that we generally have across the board in terms of making that jump towards the customers, developers and the end users who are going to use that. There's a lot we can do in terms of the pricing mechanism, I think, in terms of encouraging the commercials, but there are some very important structural things which have been touched on today, particularly around the electric pricing, which are critical to that. But you know, it's a situation where I think we need to have a very open debate about what needs to happen next in terms of jumping across to getting customers involved. It's fine sort of maybe talking to a whole range of people who are all on the same side in terms of where the direction of travel is, but we need to convince the wider market to encouraging that. So we need to be getting that message out.
Tony, is industry adapting quick enough?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's certainly part of our role, is to raise awareness about the opportunities in the market and then provide the support to then allow companies to activate. But the truth of it is like there's never 100% funding for support. So if you need new equipment to manufacture, there's support there for companies to adapt and to take advantage of the market. So the companies do need to be kind of willing to meet us halfway. And I think all it's like a glorious cake. The ingredients are coming together, but I think there's still a bit of hesitation from industry. I think they want to see where their contracts are coming from. You know, they want to see the pipeline of projects. So I think, until we've maybe got that more lined up, it's still a wee bit of a hard sell to get your some of your engineering or manufacturing companies engaged. But having said that, I think when we talk to them about it, they are excited about the opportunity. They can definitely see that it's an opportunity, but I think there's a bit more work to be done.
Yeah, the commercial aspects, is it 50-50 at this point? My kind of view on it is that probably the public sector need to take that lead in the early stages, and then allow the kind of tipping point to get reached that allows the private sector really to take over. I'm keen to kind of get a couple of questions from the audience, and if there's anybody brave enough to stick up their hand. Matthew up at the back.
Hi, I'm Matthew Black from Kenza. I think my question is, so at Kenza we see the future of low carbon heat is the lowest cost and the lowest carbon solution, and we see that in 5th generation ambient temperature heating systems connected to ground source, so ground loops arrays, but also integrating other sources of energy as well. And my question is, a lot of policy and discussions that I hear about are centred quite a lot around high temperature heat and 3rd and 4th generation. And I wonder if anybody has done a comparison or a cost benefit analysis between the capital and operational costs of high temperature heating versus low temperature heating. I'm slightly worried that we're all running swiftly into a high temperature heating world without looking at lower temperature heat networks, and it seems to me to be a sort of gap in that research and study there. So I wonder if anybody else has any other experience or any thoughts around that.
Pick up on that. Maybe is there any other questions from the group, and I'll maybe one of them.
John Salmon, back from UK. Cost came up a lot this morning about cost and systems being a challenge. I wanted to ask, probably mainly for Sam, why we're still pricing in backup when we might be able to stop pricing in backup.
Okay, anybody else? Donald. I don't know everybody here, by the way, just a few people have asked, So I don't feel bad if I don't know you.
We'll see you in the pub later.
Well, it's probably one for you, Doreen, actually. There's been quite a bit of talk this morning about something that I think is an issue, but also an opportunity, which is the skills gap. And really, I'd like to hear what the plan is there, if there is indeed one, between Scottish Government, Scottish enterprise, academia, around grabbing that opportunity for the young workforce in particular.
Okay, so maybe Doreen, I'm not going to put you on the spot in a couple of those. I'm going to that capital cost of high temperature versus low temperature, and it's a policy issue as well. So are we policy rich, decision poor? Is that something like, can we just
Policy rich, decision poor. Well. Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to awareness, doesn't it? Because I guess people know more about the kind of 4G and the higher temperature than they do about lower temperatures. So it's kind of educating our policy makers about the different options and the advantages of the different options. And not that I want to beat our drum or Ramble's drum, but the report that we did actually kind of, I think, prompted Scottish Government to have a look at the kind of waste heat sources and realise that there was more data that was needed in terms of high grade heat and low grade heat, and also I think they're probably looking at policy decisions in terms of you wouldn't be allowed just to let your heat escape up the chimney. You're going to have to do something with that waste heat, be that for your own facilities or be that as part of district heating. So yeah, I mean, I think more information, definitely. The more we have, the better.
Yeah, and it's probably too much, I guess, to expect the public sector to kind of define the technology that's needed across. And my point earlier on about not one size fits all.
Yeah,
Sam, maybe
not going to pick the winners.
Yeah.
So
Sam, kind of picking up on that kind of high temperature versus low temperature and the kind of carpet push point. I guess one of the things about the high temperature network, steel insulated pipe, all that stuff, you know, it's tried and tested. You know, we look at what's been done, you know, elsewhere in Europe and say, well, you know, why would we try and deliver something like 5G HC when we know we can deliver some of that higher temperature stuff, you know, effectively, and we've tried and tested method. But what's your take on it? Do you feel that we kind of need to make this step towards lower temperature, towards 5G HC? And I really hope you're going to say yes.
Yes. For me, I think that the kind of significant benefit of going to a 5G network is you're not penalising yourself by the poorest performing building in terms of how much heat you need to deliver, the temperature of heat you need to deliver. So any network which doesn't have the heat sources decentralised is trying to deliver heat at a temperature which satisfies the building that's effectively the poorest performing, needs the highest heat. So I think from that perspective, from a retrofit perspective, it makes a hell of a lot of sense, because you can take buildings that are listed buildings, for example, that will never be able to work on a 55-degree temperature or whatever you feel the kind of academic optimum is, and they can take the heat from the network in the summer when that low temperature is fine, but in the winter they might have their own energy source. So you're getting the kind of best of both worlds, in my opinion, with 5G. You can maximise the efficiency of the network, and you can give the buildings that cannot accommodate those low temperatures the option to use the heat when they want it, and then boost it themselves. This kind of becomes their problem rather than everyone else's problem to satisfy their poor performance.
I'm going to take that point about why pricing in for backup and maybe just put it from a kind of client perspective. I think there's an issue and a challenge for us in terms of how we move either domestic occupiers across the district systems or how we move commercial occupiers over the district systems as well. Is there's always going to be that what if it goes wrong, you know, and I think that point about us being at this early stage of development of the project is, you know, we probably always feel that there is a kind of need for backup, at least to give people the confidence that it's there. So part of, I think, the backup thing is a client-driven perspective, you know, and there's probably, again, there's a knowledge gap there as well, and a confidence gap that probably needs to be addressed in order to kind of move fully away from something that's not got that kind of backup type system sit within. I know that maybe oversimplifies it, but I think when you're able to say to a domestic consumer, here's what happens if the network goes down, you know, and be able to give them that confidence. Hugh, could you maybe pick up on the one about skills gap as well? I mean, that's something that's very close to us at Clyde Gateway, and about how we develop skills and education and knowledge. And, you know, our experience over the last few years has been working within a relatively small pool. But what do you see as the potential for skills and skills growth in this industry?
Well, certainly here it opens up the whole market in terms of what we've learned for the European experience, and certainly the whole areas of pipe installation and heat pump manufacturing and training and installation is a key area. I think, but what we do have to do is identify, and I know we're saying about not picking winners, but it's an area where you really need to focus it, because you can't really just sit in isolation from how you'll deliver that skills gap without influencing the wider the wider policy making framework. You know, and I think we've seen that in the European context, where we've already got third and fourth generation established. But certainly the direction of travel is moving towards 5G DHC as a solution. But we do have to get to a level where we're picking targets in relation to delivering heat networks that will give clear messages to the market about what skills gaps need to be addressed. And I think that's key to moving forward. There's certainly huge potential there, as we know, in terms of the pedigree that Scotland's got in a whole range of the oil and gas sector and manufacturing. But we need those targets, I think, to be able to maximise the opportunity that can develop.
Any other questions from the group?
Thanks. I'm Jeff Miller
Jeff.
from SEC Networks.
Remember last time, Jeff.
Just to play a little bit of devil's advocate, I mean, I don't actually know the details of the supply to Magenta in this particular case, but I mean, I think, you know, a low-grade heat supply to a region from the source, I think, you know, makes a lot of sense, like we've seen at the airport project. But then when you get there, I suppose my question / comment is, is, the benefits, you are obviously raising the temperature for the building, and if there is a density of buildings there, is a localized sort of communal mini energy center for distribution to the building is not a more beneficial approach for a couple of reasons. One is the backup. You've got lower install capacity required of those booster heat pumps, but also just a wider issue. Obviously, we're talking about 5G in general, and the decarbonisation of heat and electrification of heat is such an enormous challenge for the country. We've heard that as well. If we're talking 170 gigawatt peak heating supply, even at a COP of 2.5, we're talking 70 gigawatts demand on the grid, and at the moment we're about 45. So it's astronomically challenging, and to be able to have that 4G localized storage from your 5G supply means you have that thermal storage and can offset and support the overall decarbonisation and electrification trajectory of the country. And if we're all just thinking, just my building, heat when I need it, sun amp and things are great, but I mean, if that's direct electric, it's not an efficient use of renewable heat, electricity, sorry. We've got a big challenge if we're just electrifying heat when we need it. We need to use thermal storage as a key enabler, I think.
Okay, pick up on that point, Amelia.
Just a short question related to the waste heat, industrial waste heat. What is the relation, or what are the efforts in combining waste heat long-term prediction with the carbonization of heat, process heat in the industrial, in the manufacturing? Because all the industries have this process of decarbonizing their own heat processes, and what is the correlation between that and the availability of waste heat for district heating, for example, or for other purposes?
Okay, good. And then I'll take one more. Just back there.
It was just to kind of further something Jeff said there about the grid capacity and waste heat and fourth generation heat networks. And one of the big benefits of it is the ability to sector couple. So when your electricity is you've got oversupplied, there's no demand, the wind is blowing, and you're paying these wind turbines to turn off, is a complete waste. That we should be sector coupling so that a heat network with a large volume of thermal store can take that free electricity or very cheap electricity, turn it into heat and store it for the peak heat periods that are coming in the future. I mean, we visit many heat networks in Denmark, and this is common. This happens all the time in the hybrid energy centres with large heat pumps, solar thermal. There's a network in Denmark that runs 90 days of the year on solar thermal alone, 4,000 homes. So we need to start thinking a little bit more wider on the electrical network, on the heat networks, on the waste heat networks, and start bringing all these sectors in together to give us this low carbon, cheap heat.
Yeah. Okay. And then there was a gentleman just in front of you there.
Yeah, recent, perhaps a question for Doreen more than anybody else. Recent government legislation requires all local authorities in Scotland to identify heat sources and potential customers in order to create an overall national plan. Are we seeing any results from that yet?
Okay, so a few points there. Doreen, I'm going to put you on a spot for a couple of them, just kind of picking up that point on legislation, but I guess it was probably also around Amelia's point around kind of waste heat and industry, and how we kind of get industry linked up into utilising kind of waste heat and how they manage that. Was probably kind of 2 points. And Sam, if I could put you on the spot around kind of Jeff's point around that kind of and the other gentleman's point around the kind of the decarbonisation of the electrical grid, the demand that we're putting on the electrical grid in terms of heat pump solutions and others, and how we kind of sort of decouple those elements to it, unless I've oversimplified that a bit, but you heard the questions anyway. Doreen.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to local heat and energy efficiency strategy. So all the local authorities are mandated to produce these by 2023. I think it's fair to say that some local authorities are further ahead than others. Probably those local authorities that participated in the pilot schemes, so they are coming. Also, the Scottish Government setting up a heat delivery unit, I think in recognition that it's a big ask of local authorities, you know, so to give them kind of more comfort that there's practical advice available to kind of help them to do that, and I think that's going to be announced later this year. And Borough Happold actually wrote a report on kind of sources of demand for heat, to kind of help the kind of decision making around where heat networks could be sited. But to answer your question, I haven't actually. I think probably Glasgow is probably the council that's probably the closest to making announcements. They're talking about opportunity zones, you know, for heat networks. But how much information they'll give us when they announce what the opportunity zones are, you know, I'm not entirely clear, to be honest. But I would say Glasgow's probably one of the councils that's ahead of the game.
Sam, that big question then about the decoupling, the decarbonisation point, you know, kind of local generation versus district?
I think it's a matter of constraints and opportunities of a site, I suppose. I don't think there is a one size fits all. I guess my other point is that 5G has a number of advantages over 4G. It doesn't mean necessarily that 4G is dead. The issue about electrical infrastructure is a massive challenge, and I think that's a point that's probably been put on a few posted notes, and I don't think we've got an adequate answer for that yet. I suppose thinking about that, the difficulties with 4G is the further away that heat source is from the buildings, the more it costs in terms of the relative cost of the pipework, so the less financially viable it becomes, and how far do you need to go before the electrical infrastructure is suitable to connect into this heat source rather than dissipated heat sources which it serves. So there's a difficulty there to understand what the benefits are. Storage answers that question. I think to touch on your point as well, Simon, you can effectively prices in Denmark go negative at certain points because of the kind of way in which they're smart about their grid. So there is a benefit there which you only get if you have a centralised heat source and a 4G network connected to it. So I guess the short answer to there is we need to be much smarter about how we use the electricity that we've got now and how we up that. And there will be cases where maybe a solution with lots of thermal storage overcomes the infrastructure issues, and that then, from a cost perspective, is the right solution rather than a 5G.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate probably not maybe covering all of the answers there to all of the questions. We do have a system called...
I didn't address Amelia's question on the waste heat. So I think it's a great question. We have a number of energy from waste plants at the moment that I don't think are really utilising their waste heat. So that needs to be addressed. In terms of industry, you know, distilleries and bakeries, etc. I mean, I presume, you know, if I put myself in their shoes, the first thing I want to do is how can I use that waste heat to decarbonise my processes, and then I'll look at what I've got left to go into a heat network. But I think actually, hopefully the work that Scottish Government is doing on waste heat will help to answer some of those questions, because I feel that we don't actually have the answers to that question fully at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So there is the Padlet system as well, which allows you, we have a QR code for that, which you can get back up on the screen. If you do want to submit any online questions, our partners at Vito and Open University can answer those questions as well, so there's something a little bit more detailed and complicated. Hugh, I'm going to ask for a couple of final points from Clyde Gateway's perspective, and then I'm going to try this Mentimeter as well, and I'm happy to answer what the password is again. So, Hugh.
Yeah, no, I think you know, just in terms of 5GDC, it kind of forces you into thinking in the wider context and the integration being critical to how systems will run efficiently. You know, and that's something I think that, although it's more complex, it's certainly the direction of travel in terms of where systems are going. And you know, I think some of the pilots that we've been engaging with in Europe have clearly looked at whether in fact it was originally designed or not, but have moved towards that direction of having those sort of mini hub arrangements in terms of how we would integrate all the thermal storage and power integration, and it's something we've developed for D2 grids with Spain as well recently. So all of these are pretty critical, and certainly again in the other pilots that we've been working with, that whole area of bringing in greater diversity to the system has been particularly effective in terms of improving the operation of 5GDHC. So that's something we need to look at in the context of that whole argument between retrofitting existing buildings, what that does in terms of capex towards that, and what efficiencies it brings, as opposed to using systems like 5GDHC to broaden that whole area in I would say, a much more cost-effective way in the longer term.
Okay, thank you. If we can thank our panellists on the Q&A, I'll ask them to come back to the audience and then we'll try this mentally for a bit. Thank you. So I'm under strict instructions on this one, so hopefully it's working. So if you've had a chance, hopefully you've got onto Mentimeter. You've found our interactive session. So I can see a few of you got that working. So I'm going to run through 5 questions, 5 minutes, and then that's us on to lunch. So, people have already answered it by the looks of it. So if you have £100 million to invest in energy transformation, what priority would you give? Wind energy up there, geothermal, hydrogen then coming down and through. Hydrogen is an area that Clyde Gateway isn't looking at, and it's one of those ones where I do find a difficulty in engaging in that particular debate. Interesting to see solar down there at 0, and also nuclear as well. So the next question, Okay, so next question. Rating on 0 to 10 the available renewable energy sources in terms of priority to make Glasgow the most impacts on energy need for Glasgow. I don't know if you're able to vote on that. Wow, so mine's up there at 10, then into moving across. So must be percentage terms. I'll give that a wee moment to settle down now. Where are we? Okay, wastewater. I would expect it to have seen wastewater being up there, bearing in mind what we've seen earlier on around the potential for that. River water coming in there as well. Really interesting to see the work that we're doing down at Clyde Bank as part of that, and then today mine workings coming through. I guess wind energy probably been one that we're all familiar with, perhaps having less of an impact. On to the third question then. What temperature is your thermostat set at in winter? So, not that I want to influence you in any way, but I'm 21 degrees, doesn't matter, winter or summer, classic room temperature. Okay, so somebody's down there, but is it actually less than 16? So just look around for the person wearing the big jumper today. So 19 to 20 and then 21 to 22. Okay. And then please pin on this Glasgow map a potential area for 5GHD. I don't know how you do that. Just while you're on it, can I just say we've got a big blank gap here on South Lanarkshire, but so if there's no vote, I'll be okay with that. Okay, it probably, that's good. If you could, if somebody could stick one down here as well. Now, that was probably a question that favoured the geologists in the room, and then also those who are interested in river sources as well coming through. So, okay, good to see a few coming through in terms of Cunningham, and then a few coming down in terms of river elements as well. That's probably a very big question to try and address, but thank you for that. And then I think we're on to the last question, which is what are the key opportunities and challenges to delivering district heating and cooling with heat pump technology to meet Glasgow's energy needs? Right, so that's asking you to put in a whole series of responses to that, which, bearing in mind that we're at the end of the session, unless anybody desperately wants to do that, then I think we'll pick it up in terms of the interactive poster next door. But a few elements coming up there: meeting that revenue gap, electricity cost, we kind of picked up on those issues associated with the grid, knowing where to create a network and having data for that, policy and directives, cost again, cost versus counterfactual. Not mentioned counterfactual much today, it's not came up a lot. It's interesting. Grid capacity, press enter to pause scroll, the cost of power to run heat. So I don't know if I can scroll on yourself. Buildings that aren't yet able to be heated adequately with low temperature. I guess that point about retrofit and the current energy standards, particularly of existing housing stock, I don't think we've really caught up the pace in terms of retrofit as we need to. A few others there: congested service routes. One of the lessons learned that we've had at Clyde Gateway is route proving. So we've done kind of pre-contracts to prove the route before we move on to the main contract. And then a few others there: future proving and lease risk. Procurement. I'd hoped we'd get through a day without talking about procurement, but it's there. But again, it's a challenge for all of us. Enforcing new builds to low temperature. Aligning funding with opportunity and planning. And strategically integrating mind, work and film. So there's excellent points there. We'll be able to pull all that together. So hopefully, I think that's just, hopefully I've been able to pick up most people's points there. And that kind of takes us through to the end of the presentation. So just leaves me to, first of all, to thank all of our speakers today. I'm not going to mention you all directly, but you know, we're really appreciative of people spending time to come along to speak about the 5GHD opportunity, but a special mention to our European partners visiting us here in Glasgow, Amelia. Hopefully you've enjoyed the visit to the city and the opportunity to speak about your work and to speak about 5GHD. Couple of points: Interreg North West Europe, we are one of the partners to that. Down at the bottom there you'll see 5gdhc.eu. That is our project website. If you go on there you'll see the information for Clyde Gateway as well as our other European partners as well as part of that programme.